That's a side of Jesus we don't hear about every day, right? He's having it out with the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious leaders of his day. He's saying, in effect, why do you post online about every charitable donation and fundraiser you attend, but you turn a blind eye to systemic issues like homelessness and poverty and economic insecurity? Why do you act all high and mighty in public, but secretly you do all the shady things that you accuse everybody else of doing? Why do you praise figures from the past for their bravery, and yet today don't even speak up for the very values that these brave men and women fought and died for? I think Jesus is accusing the scribes and Pharisees of virtue signaling. That's what we would call it today. And they're doing this after they've already tried to trick Jesus by creating a false choice and putting him in a situation where he's either going to be in trouble with Rome or in trouble with God. They say, Jesus, is it lawful to pay Caesar or not? And which is the greatest of God's commandment? But Jesus, ever the artful political actor, refuses to get stuck in that trap. And instead, he makes the point that the Pharisees are committed to heartless legalism, and he is committed to the way of love. He points out that the Pharisees and the scribes are neglecting the weightier matters, which are the practices of justice and mercy and faith. What David Jones calls the primary forms of love, which come out of the Old Testament prophet Hosea text, where the prophet Hosea, through the prophet Hosea, God says, "You will be my people, I will be your bride, and I will take you forever as my wife in justice, in mercy, and in steadfast love and faithfulness." And then calls the people as the betrothed to do the same in their own lives. So on the Sunday after Juneteenth, I thought it would be good to look at these primary forms of love: justice, mercy, and faith. So let's begin. The words that we read from the prophet Isaiah were made famous by Dr. King. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. These words have inspired so many people who have worked for justice over the years. These words inspired the creation of the Belhar Confession, the most recent of our church's confessions. A confession that emerged out of South Africa during a system of apartheid that the religious people of South Africa began to be troubled by. And they were struggling to reconcile their belief, their faith in a God who created all people equal, and a system that was unjust. And in South Africa, where there were a majority of blacks, it was the white people of privilege who held all the power. And so the religious leaders were troubled by that, and they worked to create a statement to signal to the world where they believed God stood in the face of this injustice. And here's the confession. Here's a portion of it, which is a statement against institutional racism, which begins with these words: we believe that God has revealed himself to be one who wishes to bring about justice. And it ends with these words: we believe that the church, as the possession of God, must stand where the Lord stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged, and must witness against all the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek to satisfy their own interests and thus control and harm others. Justice is about standing with the oppressed against the oppressor. As God stood with the oppressed against the oppressors. As God stood with the Jewish people against those who enslaved the Jewish people, the Egyptians, when the Jews were subjected to slave labor, to brutal labor, and they suffered under the Pharaoh and cried out to God for deliverance. And God, we are told, heard the cries. He responded to their need. He called Moses, who was a Jew who grew up in Pharaoh's palace, to lead the people. And it is through Moses' leadership, as well as plagues and sea crossings and daily provisions and moral guidance from heaven, that leads the people from slavery to freedom. You can't understand Jesus without understanding this story. This is the central narrative in the Bible, the Exodus story, a narrative of justice and liberation, which has inspired so many civil rights movements through the ages, including the struggle against apartheid, the liberation movements of Latin America, including the struggle to end slavery in America and to establish voting rights for all people. We've all looked back to these stories and this text to find inspiration. And Jesus wants us to know that he is an extension of this God who loves justice. What does he say at the beginning of his ministry? He says, I have come to bring good news to the poor, to the oppressed. And if it isn't good news for the poor and the oppressed, it's not the good news. It's not the gospel of Jesus. For God loves justice, and we are called to do justice and to love mercy, as the prophet Micah teaches us. And that's the second form of love, mercy. This past Wednesday, we celebrated the most merciful moment, I think, in American history. When 2 years after Lincoln declares the Emancipation Proclamation, Union General Gordon Granger made his way down to Texas, where the news had not yet traveled. And he came to tell the slaves in Texas that all the slaves of the Confederacy, including those in Texas, were now free. Can you imagine that moment of mercy for the slaves? And so Juneteenth today is a national holiday, a reminder of the struggles of our past as well as our current challenges and the work that we must continue to do to help America live into its highest ideals. Juneteenth, I think, is a powerful reminder that we won't become better by denying our past or running from it or rewriting it or whitewashing it or whatever, but only by acknowledging the truth of who we have been and who we still too often are. I think there's a deep connection between grief and mercy. In fact, I don't think we can be merciful if we're not learning how to grieve. To grieve not only our pain, but the pain of those who are oppressed in our communities, in our nation, in our world. I think we see this connection in the gospel text today. What does Jesus do after his angry words against the Pharisees? We are told he weeps. He weeps like a mother for her lost children. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Grief is the pathway to mercy. How much space in your life do you give grief? Do you allow yourself to grieve your losses? How much space in your life do you give the grief of others, of the most vulnerable, of our creation, of the poor and the oppressed in our nation? How much space do you give all of that? I think as Christians we're called to grieve the things that grieve God's heart. And I think the way towards mature faith goes through the pathway of grief. Francis Weller, the author of The Wild Edge of Sorrow, shares a story about a woman he met in Africa who was incredibly joyful. And he was curious about this, and he said, "Why are you so joyful?" And she said, "I'm joyful because I cry a lot. I'm joyful because I cry a lot." In his book, The Healing the Heart of Democracy, Parker Palmer contrasts two different kinds of brokenheartedness. There's the broken heart that shatters into 1,000 pieces, leaving us angry and depressed, disengaged, lacking in joy. But there's also the brokenheartedness that breaks open and tenderizes us towards mercy and compassion and engagement and joy. As we look across our nation, you can pick out the people whose hearts are shattered into 1,000 pieces, and they want to shatter everybody else's heart because they're in pain. But you can also identify those whose hearts have been broken open, and their hearts are breaking for what breaks God's heart. There's no limit to the evil that is done by people whose hearts are shattered in 1,000 pieces. And there's no limit to the power, the healing power of those whose hearts are broken open for something bigger than themselves. Think of all the broken-hearted leaders in our country's history, people who loved America enough to critique it, who had a lover's quarrel with our nation, who took seriously the ideals upon which we were founded, whose hearts were broken time and time again, but never stopped trying to help us become better people. Think of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Rosa Parks, Dr. King, Abraham Lincoln. Think of all the people whose hearts were broken open for mercy. Which leads to the final primary color, faithfulness. These great leaders and many others demonstrate that a broken heart does not have to disempower us and others. It can empower us and it can empower others to live into their best self. John Woolman, one of our own New Jerseyans who lived in the 18th century, was a Quaker. And he was troubled by the contradiction between what he heard in the Quaker meeting and what he experienced his Quakers doing in actual living practice. He was troubled by this belief that everyone was created equal in the image of God, and yet his fellow Quakers, so many of them, were slaveholders. And he couldn't reconcile that. As a tailor, Woolman didn't own slaves, but he was moved by a revelation from God that told him that slavery was a moral abomination. And so being a Quaker, he brought this concern to the meeting, to his fellow friends, to test the prompting of the Spirit in his life. The Quakers were reluctant to free slaves because they, like many others, were dependent upon slave labor. But because of their commitment to the Quaker way, which was to seek consensus and not majority rule, they had to make space for Woolman's revelation. They had to hold it. And they had to hear the grief that was on his own heart about this incongruence between their beliefs and their practice. So for 20 years, Woolman devoted himself to sharing his revelation from God and practicing a better way in his community. He would fast rather than eat food prepared for by slaves. And when a slave did something for him, he would pay them. His message was often met with anger and with resistance because it called his community to make significant financial sacrifices. But despite the cost, Woolman's heart held the tension between the Quaker vision of equality and the reality of slaveholding. And because the Quaker community was committed to consensus building, it too held the tension between its beliefs and its practices. As he continued to travel, Woolman remained faithful to his awakened heart. He continued to speak the truth with love. He urged his fellow Quakers to reconcile their beliefs with their practices. And this, coupled with the space that was created for all of this grief, led the Quakers to become the first religious group to abolish slavery in their community. And the Quakers began to petition the Congress years before the Civil War to address the evils of slavery. And it was the Quakers who worked to develop the Underground Railroad. As Weller writes in his book, the sin of Western civilization is twofold. It is our amnesia and our anesthesia. We want to forget. We want to move on from the evils. We don't want to hear about it. And we want to numb ourselves from the pain of what we've done and what we continue to do. And the only thing that cuts through that amnesia and that anesthesia is a broken heart. But a heart that's broken open in mercy for something bigger than ourselves. The part of us that knows sorrow is the part of us that can live into the way and the truth and the life that Jesus came us to reveal. Imagine if we as a community, as a church, as a nation could hold our grief and the grief of our neighbors. Imagine if we could learn to hold the pain of our past and the pain of our present and allow it to break us open, to take faithful action. Then we could avoid the trap of virtue signaling and discover the deep truth that I think Jesus wants us to understand, that the best way to serve our nation is to serve God. And the best way to love God is to love our neighbors and to love the poor as if they were Christ. For in fact, that's what Jesus teaches us, that as we have done to them, we are doing to him. It is the weightier matters of the law that cut through: justice, mercy, and faith. Then we live into the mystery expressed in Rashani Ray's poem, The Unbroken. She writes, "There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges great strength. There is a hollow space too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctified into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside, which is unbreakable and whole, and learn to sing, as all the prophets have done through the ages. All the people in our lives who've echoed the words of Isaiah. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Amen.